Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I call the building blocks towards planetary civilization ahead. Today's topic will be to look beyond what most people know as the triple bottom line. And I'm super grateful to be in this virtual room together with Tariq, which I think I call like a soul companion, maybe even a friend, definitely a colleague that since many years is very deep in the trenches of quote unquote sustainability. And to start the dialogue, Tariq, I'm curious to look at sustainability as if we could look at the, let's say, whole market through a lens of the bell curve. So I reckon we both agree that we need more adoption, we need less bad behavior, we need like CO2 reduction and all of that. But throughout the dialogue, I'm really curious where beyond just less bad behavior, we see the more radical approaches, the front runners who really challenge the current paradigm at its very core. And maybe to start the dialogue, Tariq, I'm curious, why did you choose the name 3BL? And just give our audience maybe a rough sketch of your involvement over the last couple of years, maybe also from what region you're working and why that makes a difference. Yeah, so happy to listen in.
Fantastic. First of all, thank you so much, Alistair, for this invitation to accompany you for this podcast and this story. It's been incredibly rich to hear the many story and weaves you've been integrating over the last few months in particular. And I think this question is really at the heart of many of the stories that I think you've really been bringing to the surface. So firstly, by background, I am currently speaking to you from the island of Bahrain, which is the tiny island that is in the Arabian or Persian Gulf, somewhere in the middle between Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iran. An island of 1.5 million people, an island that is a desert mostly, and it is an island that is really a fusion of cultures and faiths and different ways of being. And this was the context in which myself and my sister Lina started 3BL Associate. And we started it in 2010 in very much a landscape where there wasn't a context for the Sustainable Development Goals. We were still at the old MDGs. There wasn't the Paris Agreement. There wasn't a sense of even an understanding what terms such as social entrepreneurship would mean, or what even sustainability or corporate sustainability would mean. This was also a context in which you had a premise for private sector engagement, which was CSR, but CSR was really run and understood through marketing budgets, marketing teams, on one hand, on I think it's more surface level. And on its more meaningful side, it was really around our traditional family philanthropy and coming from a tradition of Bedouins and tribes really following the Islamic principles of charity and zakat and really donating a portion of their profits back into sort of a wider childhood purpose. Certainly not a landscape in which systemic thinking, exponential thinking, or what it really meant around sustainability would resonate. Now, we chose 3BL, obviously coined by John Elkington, who is a dear mentor who was for us at the time, partly because it was a framing in which was acceptable in the region. It was acceptable enough to say, okay, we are going to be working on environmental and social issues as long as the profit motive was there. There was certainly more of an emphasis on the profit motive when people received it and how they understood it. But it was something that actually we didn't find too radical. it was quite a safe vehicle in which we could enter into conversations with the corporate sector, conversations with local government, and conversations with communities. And what we found when I say sort of a safe vehicle, it's mainly around it was safe as a vehicle to educate. We found when we first came to the market, because it wasn't very well understood, one, what we were trying to do, which was systemic change through collaboration. The triple bottom line as a concept really gave us a frame in which we could educate suppliers, consumers, your policymakers, from government to corporate. And really a model and a theory of change that was coherent in their understanding of sustainability at the time, and where you could start to take people of a journey of, okay, you have your profit-making side of your business, to use sort of very simplistic terms, and then what would it mean to really integrate the social and environmental as a core part of it, whether you're a private sector company or a government. John Elkerton was very generous and gracious to allow us to use that name. He's someone who I believe also at the time when we started 3 Beyond 2010 was engaging in the region and was also seeing himself what that kind of communication looked like. Now, of course, that was in 2010. The year after was the Arab Spring, which was not built into our business plan, in which systemic change happened anyway in the region, and its geopolitics and its social configurations. Yet we still found it was a valuable framework in which we could really work forward and towards, and also in the absence of global paradigms such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Climate Treaty.
So since you were sketching, let's say, the birthing of your organization, and I totally agree that with organizations from kind of any sector, it's always a good starter, right? The triple bottom line, because like you said, it comes very intuitive. I'm now interested when you look back, so maybe it kind of makes sense to look through the portfolio of your engagements and see where there was the first opening towards approaches that you see were like digging deeper than just the triple bottom line, and maybe also where they had ripple effects just across one domain, one organization, one niche.
You know, what's interesting, Alistair, we knew at the time that the model was outdated. Even when we started in 2010, we knew that it didn't really ring true to, I think, the level of systemic change that we were seeking to seek in society. And it was true back in 2010. And of course, that's been even more reinforced today. And the particular aspect, I think, around it is how we looked at the concept of green growth. And I think at the time, I recall a couple of years after we started 3BL Associates, I had attended the Rio +20 conference on sustainable development in Rio de Janeiro. And that was really the birth, I think, of the green growth paradigm, where you had, from the World Bank to the ILO to the United Nations, really pushing forward in the mainstream that green growth was possible, that we could solve our climate and biodiversity crisis through GDP growth as well, that we wouldn't need to compromise on that, and that a growth-centered paradigm and a growth-centered society was overwhelmingly a good thing. Now, it was difficult for us in knowing that that didn't quite apply both to a small island like ours, to a wider context of the MENA region, but also when it came to the global paradigm. And I think what I'd say is today, and I don't want to spend so much time on going through the shortcomings of green growth thinking, because I think this audience knows that they're quite self-evident, I think, at the moment, on why that old paradigm isn't as effective maybe in what we need at the moment. And where we have operated as an organization is really looking at what a post-growth society looks like. what does a post-growth society look like with respect to its institutions, its infrastructures, its relationships, and its economic models. And I think one of the aspects around that is on what we'd call decolonizing development. And it's another buzzword that people are using, of course, but what it really meant for us more tangibly in our first initial engagements was working with organizations in the quote unquote global north that had their power structures rooted in the global north, their funding mechanisms rooted in the global north, yet their impact mostly in the global south, to really flip that model of what would it mean to then work with these larger legacy organizations to change their power structures, to change their organizational models, where they become more global South-centric in their ways of being, the ways of measurement, ways of integrating indigenous knowledge, ways of creating financial instruments and flows and methods. And I think our first engagement with the post-growth paradigm were really in those first movers, some of which have been nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes, to really look at flipping and changing that development model. Something you can call a post-development model, which takes away the hierarchy of development. We have a long list of who's number 1 and who's number 100, and you're somewhere along that list depending on your labor rights or somewhere on how much money you're making or otherwise, to something that's far more integrated and systemic and really addresses the power structures, which a post-growth society is intended to do.
I'm curious if you could sketch, because that's big terms, right? Like post-growth and decolonizing power structures. Do you happen to have like 1 or 2 like concrete examples on the ground by region, by like maybe also sketching the challenges that you had within the project?
Yep, of course. So first I'll say maybe to dive deeper into some of those concepts and words. So the concept of post-growth or degrowth are the spectrum of ideas, models, policies, strategies, and stories, alternative innovation methods that acknowledge the pursuit of economic growth should not always be our primary objective in society, and that growth is not always good, it's not always natural, it's not always desirable, nor is it necessary. Now, degrowth is typically seen as a transition encompassing thousands of different alternative strategies and policies, while post-growth as an economy is the destination. Now, this is not a new concept. You know, there's many different organizations dedicated to degrowth and post-growth pathways, from the Post-Growth Institute to Research and Degrowth in Barcelona. You have more famous examples such as Donut Economics, the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth. You have the Stockholm Resilience Center that have their planetary boundaries concept, and there's a Wellbeing Economy Alliance that have a well-being centric concept. But at its core, they agree on the same thing, that sustainable degrowth is the planned downscaling of production and resources use that increase human well-being and enhance ecological conditions and equity on our planet. Now, by a planned downscaling, that doesn't mean a recession, which is unplanned and socially destructive. That means downscaling particularly the most harmful aspects of our economy. So military emissions and activity, on aspects such as fast fashion, on mass and destructive agriculture and others, and then focusing on the sectors that we should be scaling and focusing on, such as education, healthcare, and others. And really it calls for a future in which societies live within their ecological means, that's based on open, localized economies, and where resources are more equally distributed through more democratic systems. Now, it's also a challenge to modern day, what I'd call exponential thinking, when it comes to innovation, or more modern day cornucopian thinking, which is the kind of singularity model that we can have continued progress and provision of material items for mankind, as long as we just advance in technology. Because it kind of looks into the core of exponential growth, which is, in layperson terms, if we think of 3% growth per year. That means an economy doubles every 20 years. Then it becomes bigger, 4 times in around 40 years, then 10 times by the end of the century, all the way quickly to infinity. Now, with that growth comes the need for exponential amount of materials, resources, demands on our natural ecosystem. There are simply not enough rocks, trees, land, people to sustain any of that in any kind of model after the next 40 to 50 years, and one would argue even in the next decade. So it really places at the core what our systemic challenge is. It really places at the core why green growth as a paradigm, or our traditional ways of thinking of sustainability just aren't compatible with what the biophysical realities of this planet is, and how we operate. And then the bigger question is, okay, if that is then true, then what? What does that even mean? And I think it goes to the very first point you mentioned, and looking at kind of that bell curve of our traditional models and how we are, even in our most innovative forms, working within this current system are not enough, and are not even sustainable across 2 generations. And therefore, is sustainability even close to the term that we should be using for our current paradigm?
I agree. I reckon most of the listeners agree. So when I now look at your own business model, which is kind of consulting, advisory, but ultimately really striving to find these precious acupuncture points where we can dive deeper into the assumptions that are usually underlying sustainability. Where do you really see regional, bioregional municipalities or bigger organizations really at least test driving a different modus operandi, be it in a degrowth, post-growth scenario? Really curious on that.
So I'm speaking to you a few days out from COP27, which is UN climate change negotiations that will be taking place in Egypt. And we've been very engaged in the climate process and strategy across civil society, business, and national organizations. And I think because it's kind of quite present, I'll use climate kind of as the example of what it really means within a post-growth context, how we approach it, sort of more specifically with our engagements, as well as some of the potential pathways. And I think because the climate crisis is a symptom of this very structural failure, us as a consulting organization, when we're working with states, for example, on their adaptation strategies, and look at what does it mean to be breaking free from that infrastructure. And we see that when we look at our current financing instruments for climate action, they are focused on locking critical civic infrastructures into rent-seeking models. We see that when it comes to contracts, they lean toward offsetting liabilities to actors who already absorb disproportionate climate risk from migrant workers, indigenous communities, and particularly women. In the Gulf specifically, we see that in the Gulf region and the Arab world, we have savings and salaries of the most marginalized. So those who are migrant workers, them sending remittances back to their families in South Asia for the purposes of recovering from floods, fixing houses after climate impacts. Actually, this is a form of kind of self-funded loss and damage funding, where even those that have really given up many of their freedoms, unfortunately, in really seeking for a better life, quote unquote, actually no longer even able to have the savings that they were hoping for at the moment because of those climate impacts and the models that are into it. Of course, our land ownership models at the same time prevent neighborhood-led affordable housing and resilience, and that unaffordability, of course, stems from a house being a financial vehicle of value rather than extraction. There is also a over financialization of ecosystem services, which I feel is probably the most dangerous aspect that I think of our growth paradigm at the moment, because we're applying our models of commodification extraction to the rest of nature. And I think finally, this is all happening in a context where this COP will be about what does a loss and damage facility look like, which is, what does it mean to really fund the already vulnerable communities around the world being faced by climate impact, and where the existing climate finance being proposed by the Global North is not even close to enough. But even when it does exist, it is largely in the form of loan facilities and public and private sector investment. Now, there's a few challenges with that. One, it's still being driven by an approach of the pursuit of economic growth and growth in GDP. And we know that growth in GDP scientifically cannot be plausibly decoupled from growth in material energy use. Two, it reinforces post-colonial hierarchies in trade, moving our natural and physical infrastructures from the commons or even state-owned in impacted communities to the private sector. And that comes with the loss of labor rights, that comes to a loss of sovereignty. And ultimately, it's not a system that is designed to scale good jobs, skills, standards of living, but also really going to the core of fixing the climate crisis. Now, our approach as a consultancy is, when it comes to the innovation aspect of this, it's starting with the acknowledgement that capitalism doesn't innovate, people do. Capital usually appropriates human innovation and organizes it as much as possible around servicing the interests of capital accumulation, which is exactly what you don't need as the core goal of your climate adaptation strategy. And actually then the key to leveraging climate technologies, the key to leveraging those moonshots, is the approach that efficiency gains are far more impactful in a post-growth economic model, where the innovation itself is organized around servicing human well-being needs. So when we are in engagement with a client, particularly when it comes to a climate adaptation strategy, it is an approach that is going towards commoning critical climate infrastructure, putting it back into the commons and moving from centralized to distributed organizing. It is moving from project-based adaptation funding to portfolio approaches to adaptation. It is an approach of moving towards private sufficiency and public luxury. So this idea that actually what should be considered luxury and high end in society should be in public and the commons, instead of it being costly and unequal into the private sector. A large approach is also reciprocal stewardship models between human communities and other communities that we share this planet with, and other species. So we take a multi-species approach to stakeholder design, and I'll speak about that a little maybe in a bit more detail. And it's also looking at finance in a very particular way as a clear and quantifiable manifestation of power. And when it comes to finance, we really need to have strategies to democratize, decommodify, defossilize, actually our economic process around a just transition. That's the framework that we then apply to climate adaptation, whether it's we're designing projects around green building retrofits, whether it's projects around new vertical farms, whether it's around everything from animal husbandry to mangrove resilience and coral restoration. And it's a very different frame to what then we're actually presented with initially from maybe a multilateral institution as this is the template that you should follow, which was the former. And of course, the former is there because those are where the power structures are. It's just the reality and the pragmatism as well of where the fundings are. We have to be really realistic about that. It's actually where if a small island and developing state needs tomorrow to be building climate resilient infrastructure, it is the former in which they will need to be going to as a mechanism. But there's only so long in which that can be done, because further debt and further lack of sovereignty and further a move away from democratization only hurts us when it comes to climate action. And I think that's where a post-growth mentality strategy really comes in trying to shift that kind of intersection of polycrisis.
I wonder if you could sketch. I still have the feeling we're a dash on the meta level. So I feel like listening in and asking you, from all these complex concepts, what are projects that give you hope? And if you sketch 2 or 3, what are underlying structures or templates that can emerge to help those examples scale?
Yeah. So I'll focus on kind of the one aspect I mentioned, which we're very passionate about. It's something that brings us always a lot of excitement as well to work on, and we feel is really an example of what it means to really think beyond in this kind of paradigm, which, as I mentioned, some of the reciprocal stewardship models between humans and other species. And a number of years ago, we started a initiative called public-planet partnerships, as opposed to public-private partnerships. Now, of course, in the more traditional paradigm, public-private partnerships are viewed as critical to achieving the SDGs and to bridging the annual investment gap of $2.5 trillion to achieve them by 2030. Yet, I think within that, we see that we've overlooked perhaps our greatest social and economic partner, which is nature itself. And my background is in the field called biomimicry, which is about the science of learning from nature and nature's engineering models and principles and emulating that into the human world. But we are very sensitive of, in our current models, we try to protect nature and conservation. We try to learn from nature in biomimetics or bio-inspired technology and design, but we're not actively partnering with the natural world. We fail to consider in this $2.5 trillion gap that, yes, on one side, there's almost $100 trillion in complementary ecosystem services provided to the natural world and over 3.8 billion years of research and development. But actually, it's the growth-centered paradigm, which is, in one case, and I hate to use this term, degrading that asset, if you want to look at it from that kind of lens. And on the other side, really losing out from what it means to be fully inclusive of not just one other partner when it comes to our partnerships. So we can sit in a typical PPP and think around food sustainability of our farmers, of our Ministry of Agriculture, of our sort of larger biotech companies, our distributors. And if we're to miss one of them, we may say, actually, we're not being fully inclusive of our wider stakeholders. Yet we don't think the same around, are we missing 7 million other species as well when it comes to our economic model? And this was kind of a question that we had of, okay, it's a nice concept, it's a nice theory, it's a nice thought process, but what does this really mean in practice? So we started to look at different innovators around the world that were really thinking about a public-planet partnership, of really looking at integrating another species or ecosystem as a fundamental part of their innovation or economic system in a way that was either mutually beneficial, so that was symbiotic at best and mutualistic at best, or commensal at worst, which was you have a relationship with another species that was neither harmful to the species nor benefited it, but was actually solving for a problem. And it was very inspiring to look at all around the world innovators that were, partnering with fungi to fight global hunger by creating climate adaptive crops, to partnering with pigeons to monitor air pollution in a way our traditional air pollution monitors couldn't, to partnering with the ocean to clean waste. And we did a process where we looked at 50 different innovators around the world reversed engineered what their process was to look at what would it mean to create a public-planet partnership, where you are creating an economic model where you can look at nature as a data partner, for example, whether you're partnering with frogs to monitor water quality, or partnering with bees to measure biodiversity data, or you're looking at nature as a waste manager. So partnering with dung beetles to eliminate dung and animal waste in a way that's regenerative, whether it's working with nature as a sensor, partnering with rats to detect landmines, whether it's working and collaborating with nature as a therapist, and partnering with forests to improve human health and as a therapist. And we started to go through this model of forming almost these archetypes around what do these collaborations look like between humans, other species, and institutions. And for us, that was probably the most inspiring work that we really encountered. And one, you're opening up collaboration and innovation far beyond one species. It starts to have a wider conversation around what do rights in nature look like, what do indigenous rights in nature look like. And it starts to go into what does it actually mean to have an innovative mindset where we're not imposing our innovation onto nature, but actually the very goal of social innovation is to fit in the wider commons and ecosystems in which we operate. Now we've taken this model and worked with large-scale cities in the Gulf to map out in their wider ecosystem, these are the species that exist, and then what does it mean to create collaborations, micro collaborations and macro collaborations across the city, to working with organizations such as IKEA and the World Economic Forum to bring this mindset of a more than human stakeholder approach to innovation, to working with the World Food Program and their innovators of we're not just trying to serve the food needs or food supply chain needs of humans, but what does it mean if we flip that kind of conversation on what does it mean if we're serving the entire food chain and actually working as the World Food Program to ensure that there's zero hunger in the more than human world as well, and across the supply chain that we have, starting from our fish and our ecosystems and oceans and beyond. And I found that of anything we've ever done, that has been the one framework that really both captures the imagination, but really goes to the core of what does it really mean to have a radically different paradigm, one that we bring to the design table, to the scientific table, to the policy table. And it's impossible to have that kind of conversation in a traditional green growth mechanism. You're forced to radically step out of it. And one of the reasons we feel it's the case is it really challenges policymakers as well on your ecological literacy, which is something that I speak about a lot. And it's important, I think, for anyone in business, anyone in the private sector, anyone who's really doing policy on that level, to have some sense of ecological literacy, to have some sense of understanding the laws of ecosystems at the very least in their locality. And it's one in which we found is a far better educational tool for us than the triple bottom line, as we found to have that kind of conversation.
Some of the things you're mentioning, so beyond speciesism, sounds really radical. So when you're mentioning these large super tankers, these biggest organizations on the planet that are trying to tackle some of the challenges we collectively face, obviously we both can't look into a crystal ball, but where do you see the conversation going, and where do you already see, at least as seedlings, some of the adoption within, for example, as you mentioned, the World Food Program, and taking into account that ultimately, I mean, it's really just a very simple, one level of abstraction, cybernetic thinking, that obviously to ensure our food as human beings, we also need to think about the other species, because they also need food. So it's actually not that complex, but it seems, I often have the feeling in these conversations, you hit like almost like a glass ceiling. So what's happening beyond that glass ceiling? Who are the organizations who are really trying to make a difference with these radical approaches?
Well, you know where I think where we are now, which is where I feel we've hit the limit. I feel we've hit the limit for the hackathons, the boot camps, the 1 week sprints, because I feel that those have been largely, I think, our entry point into many of these larger organizations and spaces where there's a very safe container to bring these more radical ideas in, that people feel it's safe to experiment with them, to apply them as a lens almost to their innovation. And then, okay, if it works, then we take it forward and we see what kind of approaches from there. And there was a certain point where that was very helpful and that was very useful to have. And with the larger organizations, it would be in the form of the shorter boot camps, whether it was 1 week or 2 weeks, whether it was sometimes you even have your half-day workshop at very large conferences in which prominent decision makers attend. And I'd actually say that now that is the barrier. It was both what was helpful as the entry point, but it is also now, I think, where we're stuck. We're stuck at almost at an experimentation stage and not being able to take it from experimentation to changing a system. Now, the more radical maybe would say it's there by design. It's why these boot camps exist and why these smaller, shorter versions exist, to stop that larger socio-ecological transformation. And that's kind of one argument from I think those that are more radical activists saying, well, this is the point because it stops that larger transformation. On the other side, I feel, especially because of where the power structures are at the moment, we are both simultaneously needing to create the innovation, I think, side of what we're doing, for example, around public-private partnerships. At the same time, have to really acknowledge there doesn't exist any funding mechanism in the world that is designed to fund these particular type of collaborations. And you're kind of building on both sides a new legal structure, a new institutional structure, a new way of thinking and actually worldview around the world, and also trying to build your new financial vehicles to even fund these within the current system. I think it's the last one for me is where I see the most movement and I think the most innovation in the next coming years, because I think we're all at this point, whether we're the more than human rights people, whether it's climate justice people, whether it's the food transformation people, whether it's the radical civics people, I'm seeing a deeper introspection around what is the economics and the economic framework in which we're operating in, recognizing that it's very much interwoven and tied, and that we're going to need some very unusual financial solutions and mechanisms and pathways. And I think we've not focused on that enough. I'd say one, also even I see in the post-growth community, in the regenerative community paradigm, on what that really looks like in large institutional structures, from the World Bank, ILO, and others, all the way down to sort of the mid-range of your Green Climate Fund, where there is no pathway for this kind of project to exist, all the way down to the private sector, which is now being called to step up and from the conversations yesterday at the GCF board meeting, really take the place that states were intended to take. And I think it's really the financial mechanisms where I see the conversation and the breakthroughs really happening. And it's the one I think the wider common-centric community are probably the most uncomfortable about, and where we certainly need to head.
Yeah, I agree on being very uncomfortable with it. Nevertheless, I think we need to stay in the conundrum. For me, it's like a koan. So for those listeners who don't know the word koan, it's like of a paradox you can't solve, at least not mentally, because I have the feeling, in as much as the machinery of maximizing ROI is part of the problem, we also need to build bridges from the old paradigm into the new paradigm. And it feels like both the innovation happening from the state side as well as from philanthropy does not offer the equivalent of, let's say, a BCD series funding round. So I think, at least that's my hope for the next less than 10 years. Let's still hope we meet some of the SDGs. Where we need to take really bold examples. So I really have the feeling, when we're talking about system demonstrators, we need to look at a whole municipality, a whole bioregion, a small nation state, where we really need to look at different KPIs, like you were mentioning, be it Stockholm Resilience Center or the Wellbeing Alliance, which creates frameworks within we create measurement that also are able to capture the multiple spillover effects from a portfolio of investments from a broad range of actors. And this needs still, I think, a good chunk of advocacy, policy work, but it also needs a lot of numbers crunching and a lot of the people, instead of sitting in the derivatives department for quote unquote old organizations, just creating virtual mechanisms. We need those genius actually to create new typologies of asset classes. So maybe let's try to look into the crystal ball, because I know we're both involved in to work with think tanks and large institutions. So what could a model, for example, for Bahrain look like? Because I know you're involved in a couple of projects there. And obviously, I'm not asking you to share confidential matter, but I think Bahrain, actually, from the size, would be a good example that could make a bold concerted effort, also because there is money available, also because they sit, so to say, the Arab region in the middle of the big power clusters. So I sense there are a variety of third attractors possible and towards new pathways for development. Anyhow, that was a lot of words from my side, finally a little bit. So yeah, just curious, what could system demonstrators look like?
It's a really interesting question, and I'll actually answer it a little bit more interconnected to the reality of Bahrain as a small island developing state, because I feel what would be true for Bahrain is true for many like Seychelles and others. And because as a small island developing state, a lot of our development thinking is also around climate action. I'll kind of continue in that lens, which is SIDS, like Bahrain, small island developing states, and the Seychelles, traditionally have poor credit ratings. And we're charged very high interest rates. And in the current models, there is a more direct arrangement where investors purchase green or blue sustainability-linked bonds for projects that are aimed to increase sustainable fisheries, for example. And actually that in itself is very interesting and almost creating a blue carbon infrastructure for an entire country and an island, where you could start to look at measuring that kind of blue carbon, where you could start to create the necessary incentives around. However, as we've kind of been talking in kind of the current paradigm, is that to lower the interest rates, sometimes these bonds are partially guaranteed from the World Bank or a concessionary loan, Global Environmental Facility, GEF. And where we come across, I guess, the current kind of sticking points is these are almost form of debt for nature swaps, where you're swapping your debt for kind of putting your ocean almost on a particular chain or a blue carbon infrastructure, and others where that can be traded, swapped. You can create incentives, investment mechanisms kind of around that. On one side, that is, as you'll see in kind of SIDS and the Seychelles and others, a very effective model to really put the investment and infrastructure that is required today, and actually through quite an innovative mechanism. And these small island developing states, I think, are really these kinds of labs for these really new, I think, climate adaptation funding models. At the same time, if I'm going to be a bit more harsh on these particular models, they are potentially another form of neocolonialism, because they exploit SIDS that are not responsible for climate change, that have low degrees of monetary sovereignty, that have high external debts due to extractive global economic systems. And instead of course, swapping that for nature structures, a just transition approach would be repairing that faulty economic structure in the first place that led to unjust and high external debt. Now, that's all well and good, but that's not the reality of the current economic system that we have at the moment. And what we found very interesting, and I think where we see small islands like Bahrain as both being, those are very, very ideal environments to create alternative funding models, mechanisms, different types of portfolio thinking that within the current financial mechanisms, we're able to fund climate adaptation projects that ordinarily wouldn't be able to be funded across civic infrastructures, natural infrastructures. And they're almost these gateways of pilots that can then, for me, should be taken in the global north, because that type of blue carbon infrastructure makes far more sense in a global north country that within it has its own debt for nature swaps that is then able to take that at scale. And I think then the key is, it's okay to do this in the short term, but these countries shouldn't be locked into that particular model. And we're not, I think, thinking around phase one. These are the innovative models that can be implemented in small and developing states, such as Bahrain, that using our current infrastructure, yes, we'll fund and swap our debt for nature in one way. At the same time, what is a way for small islands like Bahrain not to be locked in and have a transition out of those infrastructures when the next model comes and the regulatory and the financial environment enables us to move towards that. Now, the climate justice movement will use words such as that would mean monetary compensations, structural reparations, and debt cancellation, and that kind of jubilees. And of course, we don't have any model for what that looks like at the moment. But that's how I'd see the role of small islands like Bahrain. They're an ideal environment for the first phase and first iteration of those new infrastructures, from blue carbon infrastructures, green carbon infrastructures, new models in which to really at scale test that with the population, which would then serve for funding our immediate climate resilience needs. At the same time, it would be damaging on a longer term horizon, and we need to be thinking about what is phase two of getting islands out of that and making sure that we don't lock them into further models of sort of debt servicing. We can look at that from real estate as kind of that example, and I know it's something you've spoken about, Alistair, before, around models of if our real estate is just being financialized as an asset, but not actually being seen as a vital part of climate resilience, then we'll still get into a very extractive form of climate adaptation. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. If it is the first model continued, an island like Bahrain, an island like the Seychelles, doesn't really exist as a function civilization by the end of the century. It doesn't exist in its institutional forms, in its state-led forms. We wouldn't be able to actually design and plan a society on the longer term that is resilient to the climatic changes that we know are coming. And we have a term for what this field is, which is just transition. and also what a just transition would look like. But I think it's really being focused on what is that inflection point from small islands as these laboratories of innovation to flipping it towards being able to be transitioned out of this particular form of investment funding. And I think that's where I think our focus should be as small islands. Our focus should be as Bahrain. We have a reality of the environment where we're operating in a global economic system that we cannot escape. And at the same time, we can't be locked into it. Decisions that we make today for the next 100 years, because that's no way to build a society sustainably around.
So what I sense is the urgency, and since you're an expert in the field and you need in a way to accept the boundaries or conditions of the system as it is to kickstart, you were mentioning like phase one of needing to be on the forefront of innovation, but at the same time, not getting locked into the old paradigm. What are possible pathways, possible unlikely allies, possible collaborators, possibly also other small nation states, not only small island states, right, that could have an enlightened self-interest to partner together and forge a pathway out of the conundrum instead of getting locked into it?
So there's an interesting idea that's being discussed at the moment from particularly the climate policy movement in the Global South, which is to get ourselves out of this conundrum. The Global South has the power to force radical climate action. And it rests on this idea that actually the Global South is a net creditor to the Global North. That today the Global North drains from the South commodities through extraction worth $2.2 trillion a year in kind of northern prices. So for perspective, that amount of money, according to the UN, would be enough to end extreme poverty globally 15 times over. Now, for every dollar of aid that the Global South receives, they lose $14 in drain through unequal exchange, not counting the black market and illicit financial flows. So in one lens, it's quote unquote developing countries are the ones developing the Global North, not the other way around. And there's this argument that is being proposed now that really the only way that we can get out of this conundrum is partly that Global South leaders, particularly the larger countries in the Global South, like Saudi Arabia and others, really push for a radical change in this particular relationship, and starting to force where required in larger states, refusal to pay debts in some cases, creating alternative core currencies, creating alternative core payment systems. That is what is, I think, being discussed at the moment, geopolitically, I think at the higher levels, and also when it comes to the activist movements and the business movements. So that is probably going to be the only thing that really shifts the power imbalances. Now, it's a very radical proposal. It's a very radical thought. In some cases, it's also brought to stark contrast with, in the Arab region, our finance flows for climate action are around $7 billion a year, whereas we need at least $47 billion a year. And we're nowhere near bridging that gap. And at a certain point, it's those ideas that I think will start to rise to the surface of what does it mean to fundamentally change the geopolitics of this conundrum? Where is it that actually the Global South does have the power in maybe the larger petrostates to the states, particularly in Africa, that are experiencing the most drain that I talked about, and actually then starting to refuse to pay into some of these kind of neo-colonial agreements. It's a thought experiment that I think is worth looking at. I think it's a thought experiment that we'll see more of and develop more. And on one side, it's an understandable framing, I think, for me, because it goes to the very core of, I think, where some of the imbalances lie. And should we not have a loss and damage mechanism that emerges from the next two COPs. If we don't actually have the World Bank extending financial facilities that they extend around debt cancellation and others to small and developing states. If we don't have actually across OPEC and others a real clear and viable transition to a clean economy, I think these are the ideas that will start to rise to the surface more prominently.
I could not agree more, because I think we're actually right in the middle of big geopolitical challenges, including the BRICS most likely forming a separate reserve currency that will definitely, I mean, not definitely, but very likely lead to a very multipolar world order in, I reckon, less than 10 years, and disrupt the mechanisms ever since the Bretton Woods Accord and the petrodollar. So I think this is not really just looking into a crystal ball of two guys, one from the global north, one from the global south, having a virtual conversation. These are things that are really happening. Another really hopeful example where I'm involved and where I see a huge leverage is P2P asset-backed currencies that are backed by real assets, meaning, for example, water and food and stuff like that. So since I come from the background of being a trained macroeconomist, this is really, I would say, a plethora of bifurcation points in less than a decade ahead, where I think hopefully we will see complementary currencies, not speaking on the, let's say, chain infrastructure they need to be. That's for me more a technical question, but to really disrupt the power structures, we need a variety of complementary currencies. And ideally, I think they have roots on a bioregional level, but can also partner up globally, and as such provide, let's say, a way closer estimate to the actual costs involved in things such as water, especially fresh water, healthy soil, biodiversity, and food. So I feel like that's my last comment. Where do you sense is a good like ending statement where you try to tie the micro and the macro together, and maybe end with a hopeful seedling that our listeners can take home?
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. I couldn't agree more. And what I resonate about what you also shared, it's for me an approach to a non-anthropocentric way of being and organizing our societies, community, and our economy, where the human is not at the center of the narrative, but is also part of many narratives. It's also acknowledging that human inventiveness and value is dependent on conducive conditions created for our human communities by innovations coming through other communities of species and practices. If we think in a GDP lens, 100% of our economies and innovations are dependent on the 7+ billion species that we share this beautiful planet with, and that innovation is not possible in the absence of land, pollinators, trees, microbial communities that enable all of life. And by definition, our economic structures are not possible without them. And an approach to viewing the world, operating the world, being in the world that I think centers that is one that I find inspiring. It's a world that I don't want to live in. It's one that is collaborative, that is regenerative. And that for me is a world that is really centered around abundance. And it recognizes that there isn't necessarily a problem of scarcity in the world. It's really around how we organize around regeneration and equity. And that's one that from global north to global south and all of that in between, I think is a something we can organize around.
Tariq, thanks for this super rich conversation. I'm feeling very grateful for the relationship we're holding and both doing our best to really making a difference. Thanks, Tariq.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for having me on.